Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As I reflect on my journey and my Jewish journey, there are a few moments that stand out as the most important and kind of benchmark moments in the development of the person that I would eventually become. And one of those happened in my first year in university. So my whole life I had gone to Jewish schools. So I went to Jewish day school for preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, and in fact, even for university, I was in the joint program between the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and Columbia University. So while I did have the opportunity to learn from students and teachers of all kinds at Columbia, in the dormitory in which I lived were only other Jewish people. And so one of the things I chose to do in my first year of rabbinical school was participate in a Black Jewish dialogue group. And as we met for the very first time in Morningside Heights, a neighborhood with some history of those relationships, in Harlem, north of Central Park, in a neighborhood they called Morningside Heights in order to not say that we were actually in Harlem. We met and we discussed, and the facilitator began by encouraging us to discuss the things that we shared. And so we talked about being a minority, we talked about the foundational story of the Exodus, the experience of slavery, our shared involvement in civil rights, and racism and anti-Semitism that we all encountered. And as I was a part of this discussion, at one point, one of the black participants jumped in and said, this is all well and good, and these things are all true, but when push comes to shove, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're driving home, you're a white person. But if I'm 2 o'clock in the morning driving home from a party, I can't stop being a black person. You have a choice about when you want to be a minority, and I have no choice. In fact, as I've shared before, there are plenty of people who choose to not wear their kippah at various different times in their lives as a way to pass as something beyond just being Jewish, to utilize their whiteness as an opportunity to avail themselves of the privilege that comes along with that. While this individual and anyone of color never has that choice. We can't decide, well, of course I'm not going to wear my kippah in this place. They can't say, well, of course, as I go through this neighborhood, I'm going to change the color of my skin. And acknowledging that I, as a Jewish person, and as a white Jewish person, has a certain amount of privilege that comes along with that, was something that I really needed to internalize. The idea that even after I committed to wearing my kippah all the time, to saying that I never want to pass as something that is not Jewish, that my whiteness is not just something that I choose, but my whiteness is something that is bestowed upon me by others. Which is why when some of us reminisce about a time where we were far more persecuted and anti-Semitism was far more rampant, that whiteness was not bestowed upon us in the same way. But living now in 2020, we as Jews get to avail ourselves of those privileges, whether we want them or not. And as I reflect on so much of what's going on within our world today, as I reflect on the racial challenges that exist in the United States and all too often here in Canada as well, I can't help but think about the fact that we need to naso et rosh, as the beginning of this week's Torah portion says. We need to lift our heads up. We need to acknowledge the very real privileges that white Jews get to avail themselves of as part of the world in which we live. We have to acknowledge and put our heads out of the sand and realize all the very real ways that people of color, indigenous people, suffer in ways that we will never be able to truly comprehend. But the only way in which we'll be able to do that is by acknowledging that their story is not our story, that their experience is not our experience, it's not the same. And so we need to be able to listen to them, to hear their story, and to elevate their stories in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are helpful, and in ways that encourage a change to our world. I truly believe that many of us within the Jewish community are uniquely positioned in a way that I'm not sure anyone else is. We're uniquely positioned to both know what it's like to be a minority. We know what it's like to be persecuted and oppressed. but we also know what it's like to live with the privilege that comes with our whiteness. We also know those opportunities that we're availed, the power that we possess as a result. In fact, it's foundational in our story when we talk about the Exodus from Egypt. We share, not that we are slaves in Egypt, and in fact, even when we say, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam li'od atzmo ki'ilu hu yatzam mitzrayim, it is in every generation, everyone is called upon, it is incumbent upon them to remember that they were freed from Egypt. It's not to remember that they were slaves, but to remember that they were freed. That we did have that experience of persecution and oppression, but now that we're free, we have a responsibility to remember that story, to remember our persecution, to remember our oppression, and to utilize the freedom that we're provided in order to better the world for those people who are not afforded the same opportunities. That is what I view as my role, and so many of our roles within our congregation, within our community at this time. It is to remember what it was like to be the one who was persecuted and oppressed. To remember what that's like, what that feels like, the degradation that's involved, the sense of hopelessness that's involved. To remember that that's part of our story. But to also acknowledge that that's not where we are today. We're no longer in that place. We are now free. We are now white. We are now availed of those privileges that come along with that designation. And so we need to use that power in meaningful ways. We need to use that power in ways that uplift the voices of the other, that acknowledge and value their place within our society, that acknowledge and value that they have voices that need to be shared. And in many ways that means lowering and setting aside our own voice to make sure that there's room for theirs. Just as our God did the same in creating the universe, in saying, I want you, humanity, I want you, the world, to be able to exist to your fullest potential. And in order to do that, I need to pull back and make room. I need to do what is called in the Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum, in order to make room for others, in order to make room for them to be able to find a place. And that's just what God did. God pulled back to make room for us. And that means that sometimes we will make terrible choices. Sometimes we'll make choices that aren't the choices that God would have wanted us to choose. But that's what comes with free will. That's what comes with taking away some of our own power and sharing that power and giving that power to others. Not to use in the way that we want them to, but to believe in them and to trust in them and to know that they will do so to the best of their ability, that they will do so in ways that will benefit them and benefit us and benefit our world. And so as we enter this Shabbat and we raise our heads up to be counted, we raise our heads up to see the world, we raise our heads up to acknowledge the very real challenges that exist within our world, not saying this is just a United States problem, but saying it's a Canadian problem as well. We need to do all that we can to acknowledge the privilege that comes with our whiteness. We need to do all that we can to acknowledge that that is a problem. And we need to decide the ways in which we wish to use that power and the ways in which we wish to share that power. And now I'll close, because my Dvar Torah has now gone on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The same amount of time that George Floyd was on the ground, suffocating, not able to breathe. And so as we remember him on this Shabbat, as we remember all those people whose lives were terribly lost, those people who were murdered because of the color of their skin, we are all called upon to make a difference in this world, to make it the place that we're meant to be, to play our part, to do our share. Shabbat Shalom.